Hello, and welcome to part three of this four-part series on federal fiscal or appropriations law. In the first part, we discussed what appropriations were in general, provided some background on Congress's power of the purse, and introduced the legal framework of purpose, time, and amount. And in video two, covered the purpose dimension. Here, we're going to talk about the time dimension associated with appropriations. The time restriction can be found in federal appropriations law in Title 31 in two different places. Section 1502A says the balance of an appropriation limited for obligation to a definite period is available only for payment of expenses properly incurred during the period of availability or to complete contracts properly made within that period of availability. So, of course, this is written by lawyers. So to put this in simpler language, if you refer back to our first video, we showed a timeline. And that timeline had an obligation period and an expenditure period. And what this law is saying is for an obligation to be valid, it must occur during the obligation period of the appropriation. And so if it's a one-year appropriation, it has to occur before the 30th of September, the end of that current fiscal year. If it's a three-year appropriation, you have 3 years during which to enter into new obligations. The second law we're concerned about is Section 1552, which says that on the 30th of September of the fifth fiscal year, after the period of availability has closed or expired, any remaining balance in the account shall be canceled and therefore not available for obligation or expenditure for any purpose. Again, going back to our timeline, this is referring to the expenditure period, that after the appropriation expires for the purpose of new obligations, there's still a 5-year period during which we as managers are responsible for accounting for that appropriation, for adjusting obligations when necessary, upward or downward, because of things like price adjustments, or the requirement has gone away and we de-obligate or cancel the obligation, and for paying the bills, for liquidating those obligations, for making the expenditures. But at the end of that 5-year period, that appropriation is closed. Sometimes we use the word lapses, at which point the Treasury has closed that appropriation and will no longer transact business citing that appropriation. So we need to make sure as managers that as we approach that closing date, that any pending transactions are cleared and taken care of. So these laws can be reduced to what we refer to as the bona fide needs rule. So the bona fide needs rule says a fiscal year appropriation may be obligated only to meet a legitimate or bona fide need arising in the fiscal year for which the appropriation was made. So if it's currently fiscal year 2022, and a need arises during fiscal year 2022, I can use a fiscal year 2022 appropriation to pay for that need. Right? Congress provided that money to meet needs this year. I have a need this year. I can use this year's money. Pretty straightforward. The second part says that appropriation may be obligated to meet a need arising prior to and continuing to exist in the fiscal year for which the appropriation was made. So assume it's early fiscal year 2022. And I had a need that arose late in fiscal year 2021, but I was out of money. I didn't have enough money to fund this thing that I needed. So this unfunded requirement rolls into 2022. I now have my 2022 appropriation. This need continues to exist. I can buy it with my FY22 money. Okay. So if I can buy something where the need arose now, and I can buy something where the need arose previously but still exists, what can't I buy? Well, this decision by the Comptroller General 120 years ago says an appropriation should not be used for the purchase of an article not necessary for use in the fiscal year in which ordered merely in order to use up such an appropriation. In other words, I cannot buy something I don't need now, something I don't need this year. Okay. This typically comes into play late in the fiscal year. So assume it's August or September. You have a balance in your expiring appropriation. You've met all of the needs, but you have a remaining balance. The temptation is to buy something you will need next year in order to use up the balance this year. That would be a violation of this rule. We would need to either find a need that exists this year or turn that money into higher authority, turn that spending authority into somebody else who could use it. Seek a tool such as a reprogramming or a budget-based transfer in order to give that give that authority to someone who could use it, someone who has a legitimate or bona fide need for that type of money. So the kinds of situations we run into, I just mentioned this end of the year thing, buying in advance of need is a common violation of this bona fide need rule. Another situation we run into is buying supplies. One of the exceptions to this bona fide need rule are inventory levels. So let's say we work in an industrial setting where we need lubricating oil and we need rags and we need fasteners, nuts and bolts and things. And we need to have a supply of these things on hand all of the time. It's reasonable to maintain a 3 or 4 month supply of this stuff. And so one of the things we would be allowed to do with that funding towards the end of the fiscal year is to top off that inventory, because we've defined the need as maintaining an inventory level. I know we're not going to use that lubricating oil, or we're not going to use that rag until next fiscal year. But what I really need is a ready, handy supply of these things. And so we define the need as a level of inventory. Another exception to this rule are services. For a long time, the rule was that an annual service contract, and we're talking about a service that is what's called severable, a service that can be broken into smaller portions, each portion of which meets an independent need of the government. A really good example of this is groundskeeping. You need someone to cut the grass because the grass is long. As soon as they cut the grass, that need went away. You could theoretically write a new contract every 2 weeks to cut the grass every time the grass grows, but we don't do that. We usually write a long-term service contract. That contract is typically a year long because we have 1 year money. For a long time, the rule was that that year had to correspond with the fiscal year. Congress provided money in fiscal year 22. My contract needs to start at the beginning of fiscal year 22 and end at the end of fiscal year 22. About a decade ago, Congress changed this rule and said a 1 year appropriation can buy a year's worth of service, but that year does not have to correspond or be synchronized with the fiscal year. In other words, I can write a groundskeeping contract that runs from January 1st to December 31st. The advantage of this is that I have that contract in place the first quarter of the next fiscal year. In case I have something like a continuing resolution or some disruption, a government shutdown even, this contract's already in place and already funded with prior fiscal year money. But because it's a 1 year appropriation, that contract can only be a year long. Okay. These severable contracts, we fund incrementally. We fund them in a 1 year increment. We have other types of contracts though. Let's say we have a contract to overhaul a pump. We have a pump that's broken. We send it off to a repair place to repair it. That is not severable work. That work is entire. A partially repaired pump does me no good. The need of the government is only satisfied when a properly functioning pump is returned to the government. In these cases, we fully fund that contract. Let's say it costs $3,000 to repair and return this pump. But it will take the repair person 3 months to do it. And those 3 months extend into the next fiscal year. That's okay. We can fully fund that contract and receive delivery next fiscal year and fund the entire thing with this fiscal year's money, because I can't break part of that work apart from another part of that work. I can't fund part of it next year. I need to fund the whole thing at once. Funding the whole thing at once protects the government's interests, and it also protects the contractor's interests. One last thing we may run into with this bona fide need rule are multi-year procurements. Let me give an example from the medical community. Using modern inventory methods, the medical community wanted to buy certain pharmaceuticals, but not take possession of them. Rather than have the government maintain the inventory, we wanted to have the large pharmaceutical company maintain the inventory, but provide it to us on demand. If there was a surge of some mass conflagration and we needed a lot of medicine to deal with burns, we would want to pre-purchase this, but have the pharmaceutical company maintain the inventory for us and ship it to us on demand. This saves a lot of money. We're basically reimbursing the pharmaceutical company for the cost of maintaining a little bubble in their supply chain in order to meet that need on short notice. But it relieves us of the cost of maintaining that inventory, of keeping a warehouse, of buying it and throwing it away when it expires and buying it again. So there's savings to the government. Typically, a company will only do this if we can guarantee them 4 or 5 or 10 years worth of work. But with a 1-year appropriation, we can't do that unless we receive permission from Congress. Congress could grant us a multi-year procurement authority to enter into a 5-year contract that we would fund with annual appropriations. Otherwise, we would have to do annual contracts. Okay. So we've got a chart here that shows the general rule for supplies. We buy supplies when they are the bona fide need of the period in which the need arises that matches the appropriation we have. But we also have an exception for stock levels that we discussed. There's also another exception for lead time. If I know I need this item in October, which is next fiscal year, but it takes the manufacturer 2 months to build it and ship it, then I can purchase it. I can obligate the prior fiscal year money because the need really arose in the prior fiscal year to get it on contract in order to meet my October requirement. Okay, so it's when does the need arise, not when is the need satisfied. And as we said, for services, the general rule is severable services. You fund the project with the bona fide need of the fiscal year during which the work occurs. For non-severable, you fund the entire project upon award. But the exception is we can fund any 12 months, provided the 12 months start during the fiscal year that we cite. Yes, that it can start anytime in the fiscal year with a duration of no more than 12 months. So that sums up the bona fide need rule and the time aspect of appropriations law. In the 4th video, we'll deal with the last characteristic, which is amount and the Anti-Deficiency Act.